What do you think of when I say the word bias? Unfair prejudice? It's negative, right? Today I'm calling you biased against bias. Its second definition, handily provided by Oxford Dictionaries, is a systematic distortion of a statistical result due to a factor not allowed for in its derivation. Bias can be positive in influencing how we interpret data. I'm sure you know artificial intelligences can be biased. In fact, it's often their builders' greatest challenge to remove as much bias as possible by perfecting the art of a curated training dataset. What if I told you bias can be helpful? Take Alzheimer's dementia, for example. Until recently, it wasn't clear to see on brain scans unless you knew to look for it based on psychological examinations. Like many other conditions, it's far less likely to be present in a young patient with no relevant risk factors than in an older patient with a history of neurological problems. So, human doctors quickly determine it's unlikely to be the correct diagnosis for a young patient and will look for it in an older one. In radiology, artificial intelligence models trained on unbiased datasets might look at a brain scan and make its diagnostic recommendation based on just that information. By removing as much unnecessary information as possible that might induce bias, such as age, race, gender of patients, the models give what could be argued to be the most scientifically accurate suggestion. They're fundamentally probability algorithms, so giving them unnecessary information could reduce test sensitivity, defined as the proportion of positives correctly identified. However, let's imagine an identical model that is this time given background on the patient's information. Now, it can self-assess the realism of its prediction, maybe spending less processing time searching for dementia in a younger patient and more in an older one. Pre- and post-test probability analysis is widely utilized by doctors making informed decisions about diagnoses. They're defined as the probabilities of the presence of a condition before and after a diagnostic test, respectively. What may be fairly obvious is that these values are used to determine the likelihood of the presence of a condition regardless of any radiology results. Could giving an artificial intelligence model the same capability be a good thing? It all comes down to what we want these models to be. A helpful tool to sit alongside a radiologist, maybe we don't need to let them develop their own pre- and post-test probabilities, but they could be tacked on to the end of any diagnostic suggestion as helpful tools for the radiologist to review. Tasking the AI with completely replacing the radiologist, currently unrealistic for particularly unique scenarios, but a perfectly reasonable suggestion for routine scans. In this case, we need to find a way to implement pre- and post-test probability analysis without risking test sensitivity. Bias is scary. Its introduction means we are purposefully inducing bias and prejudice into our models. Watchdog investigations on health services such as our NHS have repeatedly shown the risk of bias. How medical textbooks lacking diversity and illustration train doctors to misdiagnose patients with high melanin levels. How women are repeatedly mislabeled as suffering only from the hormonal effects of menstruation. So why should we introduce it to AI on purpose? Ideally, we would use a completely unbiased AI. It will be trained on such a vast and varied data set of perfectly labeled data that it couldn't possibly make a mistake. This won't happen. Our available data set isn't good enough. Radiologists across the UK use pre- and post-test probability analysis every day to make millions of diagnoses. In pursuing relevant diagnoses for their patients, these doctors make tiny, biased decisions. If we give an AI model this data and train it using the most cutting-edge techniques, it will develop its own understanding of pre- and post-test probabilities when provided the relevant demographic data. Neural networks are notoriously confusing. With generated weighting so complex, the engineers building it can't be sure what's going on in an algorithm before they test it. What matters is how we control this. When a model is trained to limit bias, we use labeled datasets, stripped of unnecessary information, like race and residency. If we gave these models demographic information early on in training, we risk inducing more bad bias, instead of replacing generated bias with purposeful good bias. Maybe you're thinking, hey, didn't you just spend 4 minutes persuading me to let models use this data? And you'd be right. The important distinction, though, is that we don't want to let them develop their own likelihoods. That's how we end up with cases like the healthcare-based risk prediction algorithm used on 200 million American citizens showing racial bias. It was supposed to predict which patients needed extra medical care, but due to improper testing and trading across races, it failed to recommend care for over 60% of Black patients who needed it. So, we've identified that good bias is about adding realism and likelihood into our models. We also know that bad bias happens when models generate their own likelihoods from insufficient training data. We don't want algorithms trained on skewed datasets that aren't globally applicable. We do want to induce good bias by refining our artificial intelligence models. How do we bridge that gap? The ideal method is to train a strong model with limited bias, and then introduce the concept of pre- and post-test probabilities as statistical points to be used in future analysis. If we give the models information too early on, they might interpret gaps in datasets as being due to fundamental truths, like the risk prediction algorithm, assuming that Black patients were always healthier due to the gaps in its dataset. Once we've trained the algorithms on diverse, scrubbed data and cleaned off any demographic information, we can get started. Working with statisticians and leading medical professionals, we humans can develop our own pre- and post-test probabilities. We all know what happens if we let models develop their own. But some medical conditions do genuinely have demographic links. Older patients are far more likely to have experienced a stroke than younger ones. In this way, we can let experts determine which likelihoods are worth meshing into our algorithms and which ones only exist because we as humans will never be a perfect dataset. Let's imagine this algorithm has been created. Radiologists can prioritize their time. With a well-trained tool at their side, they're given reports on their patient's medical imaging, its likely meaning, and probabilities are attached. Instead of listing hundreds of super rare diseases, like, let's be honest, most of us let the internet do after fairly insignificant symptoms, the most probable ones are highlighted. In multidisciplinary team meetings, there's time for the most unique and pressing cases to be discussed. Millions of more typical cases have already been analyzed by radiologists working alongside the AI tools, reducing the need for extensive multidisciplinary team review. There have been at least 2 sets of eyes on every single diagnosis. In this efficient healthcare system, we don't sacrifice thorough evaluation for the sake of pace, ever. Artificial intelligence models specialized for radiology are being developed today across the world. With an additional layer of human-manufactured pre- and post-test probability analysis, they could be perfected. Propelling us towards a less biased healthcare, we must be careful when generating its probability values, reducing the risk of implementing excess human bias. It's not an impossible task, though. We can minimize unneeded data points and scientifically back the data we do provide. Now, we've redefined bias. Let's get it right. If we do, implementing good bias will harmonize human expertise and technological innovation. It could be the key to revolutionizing radiology. Thank you all and have a great night.